Hello and welcome to today's episode of Carbon Experts Live. This is our conversation series hosted by Click LCA, where we are talking to exciting guest experts about topics in sustainability and decarbonization of the construction industry. So we are so excited to have you here today. Go ahead, if you are joining us, and go to the comments tab or the chat box on whatever platform you're joining us from, and let us know where you are calling in from today. I know we have an audience from around the world, so we love to see where everyone is joining us from. So go ahead and let us know in the chat. And today's episode is Net Zero for All, Unlocking Achievable Low Carbon Construction. Going to be a very exciting topic. I think you guys are going to get some great takeaways from today's conversation. My name is Aileen. I am your host. I'm with the marketing department here at Click LCA, and I'm calling in from Virginia in the eastern United States. And I'm joined by my co-host, Travis Dahl. And Travis, where are you joining us from?
Today, I'm back in Calgary. That's sometimes where I'm at.
Yeah, Travis usually joins us from Canada, and it's early in the morning there. And Gilbert, where are you joining us from?
I'm in London, sunny London.
London. Wonderful. So Gilbert, as you have seen, is our guest expert for today, Gilbert Lennox-King. He is joining us from Construction Carbon. So we are so excited to have you here. Now, a few notes before we get started. Carbon Experts Live. This is, like I said, it's our live conversation series. If you want to see more episodes, past episodes, see our schedule for upcoming episodes, you can always head over to oneclicklca.com/Carbon Experts Live. And for today's episode, we'll just go over a few housekeeping rules and what you can expect for today. We'll start with the main questions that Travis has prepared for Gilbert, and they're going to be having a conversation about low carbon construction. So that will be really exciting. And then we are going to have time for your questions. So during the conversation, if you have a question for Gilbert, if you have something that you want to bring up or a comment, please go ahead to either the chat or the comments box or the questions tab. Wherever you leave those questions, we will find them and we will be able to answer some of those during the live Q&A session. And then we will wrap up. Travis has some challenging questions for Gilbert, so we'll wrap up with those and we will see where that takes us. And just real quick, I'm seeing some of the answers come in from the chat. We've got folks from Norway, the UK, we've got Saudi Arabia, we've got Finland, India, Belgium, Chile, we've got New York in the United States. So we've got people coming from all over the world. So welcome. We're so glad to have you. So without further ado, Travis, I will hand it over to you to get the conversation started.
Great, thanks, Eileen. So I guess first thing, I just want to introduce Gilbert. We're excited to have him. So I guess Gilbert's passion for building efficiency really started in 2009, where he co-founded a company called Energens Consulting, where they delivered energy efficiency strategies across Asia. And this company was acquired in 2016. And since then, he's worked with a number of blue chip clients who've been working on their portfolio of energy optimization, and they're doing new build technology selection for healthier, more energy efficient and carbon efficient buildings, really across the real estate industry. Gilbert has also worked with the UK Green Building Council as co-chair for their Innovative Startup Committee, and is also involved with the UK's Net Zero Carbon Building. Sorry, let me try that one more time. This one's a bit of a mouthful. Net Zero Carbon Building Standard project. Well, thanks for joining us, Gilbert.
Thanks very much for having me, Travis.
Yeah. So I always like to open this up with a bit of a personal question, and we'll be talking a lot about profession and some of your expertise, but from a personal perspective, what sparked your interest in sustainability, and how did you end up here?
It's a good question. I think, like originally, looking way back, I think it was actually the movie An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. That was sort of back in like 2007 or something. That kind of got me interested in the topic, and that kind of set me on this path down, as you said, kind of down the energy efficiency road. And then it was only probably in the last 3 years that I realized that the embodied carbon impact, and how we've been working on operational energy efficiency for many years, and not really too many people have been talking about the upfront carbon impact. So we started looking into that in more detail, and it just it just sort of hit me as this is a massive issue. Then I basically got introduced to my now business partner Tom, and he's a chartered surveyor, construction manager, and he said, look, if we look at the market, 98% of construction companies don't have a way to tackle this embodied carbon problem, and that we think that sort of small and medium sized part of the market accounts for about 70% of the carbon emissions that come from construction. So we think there's a really kind of large chunk of the market that's looking for answers that haven't really been catered to, and so that's kind of what gets me excited about construction carbon, about this space at the moment.
Yeah, that's a really important key. Is obviously like the big companies have like well publicized goals for achieving decarbonization goals, net zero, fill in the blank, whatever that looks like. We'll come back to net zero in a bit, but as you mentioned, the breadth of the market is in the smaller companies that maybe don't have the same access. How would you argue that we can help them reach goals, or understand, or really what is needed to fill in that gap?
It's a great question. I think gradually we've seen some things kind of come into place. So firstly, like a definition, like a common definition of what net zero actually means for construction. I think that's been a very big question mark, and hopefully some of the work with the UK net zero carbon building standard, and I know there's a number of different initiatives going on throughout the world about what a net zero construction building actually needs to look like. So that's kind of one thing, and then there's the other thing is training. So agreeing on common framework for how to actually calculate life cycle assessments. And then the other thing is like, Click LCA have done some great work on training. And also, you've got your embodied carbon heroes benchmarks, but common benchmarks. So everyone's talking the same language. So, what makes up a carbon score? Is it A1 to A5, or is it A1 to A5 and the B and the C? Do we putting them all together? And there's like quite a few sort of local variations, but if you're a medium-sized contractor, someone doing construction projects, there's just so many question marks about this whole space that it's just really hard to negotiate, even if you are a top-tier developer. Firstly, what's the price for carbon? There's no common carbon price. How are we going to move forward without a common carbon price? So all these questions just make it difficult, without spending hours and hours reading hundreds and hundreds of pages of the latest guidance, which is changing all the time. How do you, as a responsible developer trying to do the right thing, just get on and do the right thing? I think that's a really challenging issue right now, and something that I think needs tackling.
So I guess I think this is kind of a two-part question regarding definitions. I wanted to talk to you about net zero and how do we define this and what is included, what isn't included, what should be included, and again with like the where if you mentioned like are we including A1 to A5? Are we including the use phase and end of life scenarios as well? How do we implement this? How do we get onto a common track here?
Yeah, so I think what's interesting about the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is they have kind of got together as an industry and said, it was initially 9 organizations, there's a few more now, but basically Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, so the surveyors, the structural engineers, the architects, the cost consultants, everyone, the BRE, the Carbon Trust, everyone got together and said, there's no point in, UK Green Building Council writing something and then another organization, like an industry organization, publishing something else. We all need to get together and work out, what exactly that is. And so that's been a huge piece of work that's been going on. And there's actually published just a couple of weeks ago some really interesting benchmarks. So across 14 different sector groups, they put out a call for evidence, basically asking for data. So give us your data on your life cycle assessments, and then have published some preliminary data on benchmarks. And there's two, essentially dividing up net zero into 2 buckets. So the first one is net zero construction, and then the second is net zero in operation. And then there's 14 different sector groups. So you got like sector, schools, offices, shopping malls, a number of different sector groups. And then they published those benchmarks. And this kind of builds on some of the work that the LETI organization have done. So the London Energy Transformation Initiative published some embodied carbon benchmarks a couple of years ago, and kind of building on that on the upfront carbon side. And then there's also energy usage intensity targets for operational as well. So it's a really big piece of work. The preliminary data is still, the data sets are still limited, but I guess the attitude is don't let perfection get in the way of getting something done. So that's kind of the attitude. So I guess it starts out with a common understanding of what net zero looks like. There's been some really good work done by the Whole Life Carbon Network, which basically sort of set out, this is what net zero construction means. So you have to assess, you have to reduce in line with these benchmarks. Then it currently still, there's an offsetting component, and then there's reporting. So you have to assess, reduce, offset, report, and that's kind of the roadmap to net zero. Within the call for evidence, there's been a lot of discussion about whether offsetting is included. And I know in France, they have this thing called the Low Carbon Building Initiative, which is basically just put offsets to the side. And that's another question for resolution. But it's, I think the key thing and the key kind of takeaway from the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard is there are now some common data sets to look at for the UK, for different sector groups, which I think will be really useful moving forward. And what I'm really excited about is the financing element. So when you start to talk about who's paying for these developments to be built, there's always a debt component, or most of the time there's a debt component. And a lot of those banks that write that debt, they really would like to make sure that they can incentivize the developers to do better and push the boundaries in terms of embodied carbon. Now, they haven't had clear mechanisms to do so to date. It's been quite hard for them to condition their lending based on things like more general sustainability ratings. But with a common understanding, they could just say, look, if you get above the 25th percentile, for example, in terms of carbon efficiency, we will give you a rebate on your loan at the end of the project, subject to auditing and verification. So I think that could be really interesting, because if you say to a developer, look, we're going to reward you for doing something that you were going to do anyway, then that's great. And some developers who were sort of on the fence about whether they should embrace green construction will actually fully embrace it, because there's an actual carrot there at the end of it. So I'm really excited about that green financing element for development finance, because what we've seen in the past is development finance has been looking at other like proxy indicators, like maybe they'll be looking like a future EPC rating, like a future energy performance rating, which is not really what they're financing. They're financing the development. So I know all these things are kind of interrelated, but I think that's a major step in the right direction, is a common understanding of benchmarks. And I know there's a few other organizations within Europe that are looking at publishing common European-wide benchmarks. So I know Ramboll released a study a few weeks ago looking at some of the variations in life cycle assessments and how we're going to get to a common understanding of what good looks like across Europe. But it's like each of these things is another kind of stepping stone on the road to an easy common understanding of what net zero is and what needs to be done to get there. So I think it's a really exciting time, to be honest.
Yeah, totally. I would love to dig into the finance side of things. I think it's pretty fascinating what's happening there. It's insurance as well. It's the way that I've described it to people is that these organizations are looking at a company kind of like a health insurance company is looking at you when you go to get your travel insurance or your health insurance. Do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you jump out of airplanes? And they're going to adjust the insurance and financing rates based on these types of scenarios, and it'll be the same with projects and with the way companies are operating with their ESG policies and how effective their net zero policies are, and auditing throughout that process as well. I think I'm excited about it as well. I think
it is really exciting, and I've seen that. Rewind a year or so back, there was a number of developers saying, "Oh, we can't build out of timber because we can't insure it." And then there's a number of insurers came out, Mass Timber Risk Insurance, the Mass Timber Insurance Playbook, published by the Association of Sustainable Building Products, basically said, like, if you want to build out of mass timber, you can insure it, and this is how you do it. So, I think insurance has a really interesting part to play. As well, definitely.
Mm-hmm. If you were to if the world came to you and asked how should we define net zero and what do we include? I like how you kind of broke this into the construction and operation side of things, because there's different groups that play different relationships there, and certain groups just don't need to know the embodied carbon side of things so much. How would you define this, and what should be included in this from your perspective? This is we're not setting this into law, but
so I think I've had I've been very lucky to have the benefit of being on the consulting side, on the developer side as well. So looking at it from a developer's perspective and understanding how they think about tenants and valuations, it basically needs to be as simple as possible. If you look at globally, the most successful rating schemes out there that have been voluntary have been those that everyone can understand, right? Like, so in Australia, they have the NABERS schemes, or NABERS, which has been very successful, voluntary. It's a 6-star rating system, so anyone can understand it, and a tenant can say, I'm not going to move into a space unless it's got 5 stars or more, and that just means it's super energy efficient. And I think that's, we like to complicate these things in this industry, but I do think, trying to keep it as simple as possible helps encourage adoption. So we talked about finance in the UK. There's been a couple of stabs at like creating green finance frameworks that have been sort of very generic in terms of sustainability, including all sorts of metrics around similar to LEED and BREEAM, that have like a very broad set of sustainability metrics. But the problem with having a broad set of metrics is it's very hard for people to kind of align around one score and have confidence in that score. So I think keeping it simple so that everyone can understand it, and then there's a very important part on the net zero journey, which is reduce as much as possible. We have conversations with developers all the time who say, well, how much should we reduce? How much should we be spending on reducing versus the offsetting piece? And it's, the answer is, well, you should be spending all the money on reduction, but the current kind of rules are you have to assess, reduce, offset, report, and that's kind of the 4 stages. So I think a global carbon price would be very useful for everybody, because what we've seen, I was involved with the UKGBC carbon pricing and offsetting report, which was released 3 weeks ago, basically talking about, okay, I'm a developer, where do I set my carbon price? Because that's going to drive decisions in my procurement. How much money am I going to spend on decarbonizing the build? And without clear market signals, it is very difficult to have a right answer there. There's no real right answer without a global carbon price. But the key thing is really as much effort is put into reduction. And I think, without carbon scores, like a common understanding of a benchmark, that's why I think the one click, Body Carbon Heroes benchmark is really great, because everyone can just go, okay, well, we're sitting here and what do we need to do to get to the next level? And I think that combined with ultimately, if you've got your A to G rating, for example, there will be a line there that's your net zero line, and you've got to get up, above the line in terms of efficiency to get to net zero. And as long as that line is continually moving up, and I think that's the direction of travel. And the Science Based Targets Initiative just published some embodied carbon pathways, which super interesting for those of you who haven't looked at them. Going to be quite hard to achieve, I have to say, but that's kind of the direction of travel, is how do we reduce that embodied carbon impact as much as possible. And that line's going to get harder and harder to achieve, but we've got to start somewhere. So
yeah, especially like as we report more, but also as we're making progress, that median line should in theory be continually ratcheting down and just becoming more difficult to hit as we get further along the road.
Yeah, like the CREM pathways for operational. I don't think anyone could sort of put their hand on heart and say, yeah, we know how we're going to get the 2050 efficiency levels in the CREM pathways. It's just impossible right now. But the main thing is, that's where you got to get to. So we know how we're going to figure that out.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier some of the key elements that are kind of making LCA and setting a lot of these benchmarks difficult is missing data or an incomplete data landscape. Can you expand on that a little bit? Just like what do you feel is missing? What do we need more of? How do we resolve this?
Yeah, so there's, over time, it starts to more and more pieces of the puzzle start to get into place. So there's obviously is EN 15978, which is like, European methodology on how to calculate whole life cycle carbon for construction projects. In the UK, the RICS, so the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, have published additional guidance on that, and they've just updated that. But it basically talks about, this is how you should calculate whole life carbon. And that's great, because that basically says, we're all singing from the same hymn sheet. We all understand how many, how to make assumptions when data is not there, what the life of the asset is, that type of thing. So that's kind of the rules around doing the calculations. But then when you look at like some of the regional variations, particularly, Ramboll's recent report's really, really interesting in that regard. Yeah, they're basically saying like each different country in Europe has a slightly different requirement for what you should report in your life cycle assessment. So do you include some of the B elements and or not in your benchmarking? So that's something that needs to be bottomed out. Obviously, in an ideal world, we'd all have the same rules for benchmarking and reporting, and I think it will get there. But there's still local variations which make it quite difficult. So are you are you including A1 to A5, or are you going to just A1 to A4 and then the B emissions? And so it's slightly confusing to anyone who is just coming in. They're like, well, am I a B or was my site a C? And we're looking at kilograms of CO2 per square meter as a single metric. Are we looking at it for just A1 to A5, or we're looking at it for all the embodied emissions and excluding the in-use energy emissions? And that's probably the biggest question, to be honest with you, how to bottom that out. And it all kind of comes back to what's the quality of the data set that sits behind it. So once we've got thousands of LCAs that have done all their A to D emissions very detailed, then we can slice and dice and make benchmarks and publish them for different locations and different types of asset quite easily. But in the short term, we have to figure out a way to get to that point, because we don't have time to sort of wait for the perfect data set to arrive. We have to sort of work with what we've got. So I think that can be a challenge.
How big of a piece do you think is missing if we were to look at that full A through D life cycle? Like if we were to properly analyze, every project that we do, how much do you think is missing from this picture?
Probably not a huge amount but it's hard to sort of say what the counterfactual is, right? Like we might have a load of life cycle assessments that are legacy, but are you going to get a data scientist to go through and sort of examine each life cycle assessment and make sure that the assumptions that all of these life cycle assessments that rest on are sound? We've got this sort of glaring hole around environmental product declarations and sort of the lack of them, and the fact that in a lot of cases substitutes for the actual material are used, or data from maybe old data sets is used. So it's quite hard to sort of quantify what the variance might be. And those EPDs, they will get there eventually, but we've still got to do life cycle assessments today, and we need to deal with construction today. So that's kind of again dealing with that incomplete data set. What the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors have done in their latest statement is basically assign a data quality score, which I think is quite an interesting way of dealing with it. You basically say, okay, well, right now our data quality score is 40%, and we're working on it, but we know that this is the challenge of the environment that we're working in. We've got to base these calculations on a number of assumptions in a lot of cases.
So, and LCA has been hugely successfully adopted. Like when we look at like the global industry, it's been really taken on strong by the UK. Why do you think it's so much? Why has there been so much adoption there, and maybe not less in other places?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think in the UK, it's probably likely BREEAM kind of forged the path for that, in I guess in the respect that a lot of consultants, a lot of big developers they're kind of familiar with BREEAM. It's been around for a very long time. It's kind of like a planning permission in a lot of cases. So you had to get BREEAM or similar, and there was only BREEAM. So I think that was an initial driver. And it's, like I said, it's been around for a long time. So that as part of BREEAM, you have to do a life cycle assessment. So that's probably a reason. I know that some of the Nordic nations are more advanced, and obviously Denmark and France have mandatory embodied carbon limits on new development now, which is huge, right? That's massive. Mm-hmm. But the UK hasn't quite taken that step yet. But Greater London Authority, the GLA, and think Manchester as well have also put in place a requirement for big sites to do life cycle assessment, and have got kind of limits in there. They're just not mandatory just yet. So the big cities are taking it on. Aside from that, I don't know how to kind of explain why the UK is leading. I think a lot of people within the UK wouldn't say that it's leading in terms of life cycle assessments, but that would probably be my explanation as to why it feels like, that there is quite a strong interest in life cycle assessments in the UK. Yeah, I think so.
What are some of the lessons, do you think, that can be taken from the UK and applied elsewhere around the world? Like, what have you guys done right that's you can apply everywhere? It hasn't finished yet, but I think the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard as a template in terms of getting the whole industry and getting 9 industry organizations together to sit down and write the rules for what net zero means was a pretty ambitious move, and I think that's something that a lot of other countries might want to look at, because if you get that everyone in the room from a building supply chain perspective, and they all write the rules together, then it would suggest that it's kind of going to be broad and widely accepted. Now, it's probably too early for me to say as to whether that is the case, but it feels to me like the right thing to do. It's not sort of one organization forging ahead by themselves and publishing the rules. It's a whole kind of broad. It's one that they're all going together basically. So I don't know. I think that's probably something to look at as in terms of an interesting template. Very cool. I know. Eileen, you wanted to join us. I think we're ready to move on to the next section. Before we do, I also just caught wind that you're working on a course, Gilbert.
Yeah, that's right. UK training course for life cycle assessors. So we're planning on launching that after the summer. To try and tackle some of these issues. It's going to be free initially as like a foundational course, and kind of focused on around the UK, but feel free to sign up if you're keen.
Great. Well, we'll stick a link in the show notes so everybody can find it.
Brilliant. Cool. Thanks, Travis.
Yeah.
That's great. Well,
yeah. Sorry.
Jumping in. Great conversation, a really interesting topic, and we have a lot of questions coming in. So our first question for you is going to be about, retrofitting the building is an emerging concept for low carbon construction. And what is your view on LCA regarding data uncertainty in retrofitting a building?
So I think first point is retrofitting is probably most of the time is going to be better than knocking down or rebuilding from a carbon perspective. And there's always going to be uncertainty in life cycle assessment calculations. So I would say there's definitely a big move towards retrofitting in the UK. And I think one of the things that's probably understated is the importance of stating your assumptions within the life cycle assessment report. So just like at school, right, I think you show your workings. I think, if you're using uncertain data, you publish a report and then you publish the assumptions with the report. And then so anyone who picks that report up years from now and says, well, how did they get this number? They can sort of trace it back and say, okay, well, they used this generic data from this database, and that's how we can work that number back. And I think that's super important. But aside from that, one of the reasons, I guess, well, one of the quotes that Tom, my business partner, loves to make is, don't let perfection get in the way of good. So just get started.
That's an excellent quote. We, Definitely have those same thoughts. Don't let perfection get in the way of good.
Yeah.
Well, that's great. So our next question is, could you give examples of key strategies or material systems that you have applied in projects to reduce their carbon footprint?
Okay. So it depends. It really depends where in the project you are. So if you're in the early stages, there's a lot that can be done. So there's a lot around the structural design of the buildings. So for example, if you're, are you going to build out of concrete and steel and glass, or are you going to, if you're at a very early stage, are you going to build out of timber? And so that's that's kind of the first stage is structural considerations, and that's can only be made once, but it's it's a fairly big decision. Then there's a huge sort of gamut of things that could be done in the material reduction side. So there's a lot of talk about GGBS and replacing concrete with lower carbon alternatives. There's not enough alternatives for lower carbon cement products. But if we look and we say global emissions, 11% of 11% of global emissions are related to construction. Out of the 11%, 7% of those are cement and concrete. So that is a really big one. So obviously look at that, and then there's the steel. So what can you do about recycling of steel and reusing waste? There's some really good stuff around foundations. So digging big basements is very carbon intensive. How do you make more efficient structures with lighter foundations, and basically minimize the carbon impact? So in terms of internally, there's loads of different materials, and I think we're only just scratching the surface on what's possible, to be honest with you, in terms of swapping out materials, high carbon materials for lower carbon alternatives. But you're starting to see companies like they're building out of hemp and wood, and huge amount of funding going into lower carbon concrete alternatives, chipboard, all sorts of stuff. There's some great platforms out there. Obviously, Click LCA. You've got options you can look at in there, and then there's others out there.
That's great. Yeah, there's quite a lot of opportunities for finding ways to lower your carbon impact. It's it's sort of the world is your oyster in terms of choices that you can make. Well, another question came in. Seeing some case studies with the UK net zero label, I've seen that they've had to buy offset credits from projects in other countries and continents. Are there any mechanisms evolving to offset environmental impacts locally? So how can we stay local with that?
Yeah, so I would encourage you, if you're interested in the UK offsetting, to read the latest UK GBC offsetting and pricing guidance, because it's got lots of stuff in there. Different companies and individuals have different sort of requirements. There's definitely a movement towards not necessarily towards buying local credits. Although there are some options in the UK, the UK Woodland Trust have some options, but they are quite limited and quite expensive. There's definitely a movement towards absolute reductions rather than kind of the likes of reduction offsets. So previously, it was kind of anything goes in terms of offsets. There's definitely more of an awareness of different quality of offsets, and publishing kind of what offsets you bought. So if you're buying 100, how many percentage you bought for reduction offsets versus avoidance offsets. So likes of renewables and that type of thing. So being more transparent about the type of offset project that organization has bought. There's definitely a lot of a growing awareness around the type of offsets. But in terms of the UK, it's just it's kind of difficult to get local ones that are cost effective, really, to be honest with you. And then there was one thing about insetting that I wanted to talk about, which is a growing awareness. Basically, it's like, how do you offset within your own supply chain? And there's this insetting platform that's basically looking at nature-based insetting. That's in its early stages in the UK, but there's definitely a discussion around, like, how do you actually use those funds to decarbonize your own supply chain rather than sort of planting, maybe planting trees in developing countries, for example. But anyway, that's maybe another topic.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's very interesting. It sounds like there are a lot of things, just like everything in this industry, there's a lot of things in progress and things are changing, and new ways of offsetting are emerging, or, like you say, new ways of looking at the quality of those offsets. So we have time for one last question from our audience, which is, please let us know a few strategies that can be adopted to make a net zero building in a cold climate, considering just having a few months of summer.
Yeah, I mean, so I would go back to kind of what this person means by net zero. So I assume we're talking about like a very energy efficient building. Just by the way, we're talking about cold climate, considering a few months of summer. So I would encourage Rincha to look at maybe like some of the Scandinavian requirements. So like for the concepts behind passive house, which is essentially you have a lot of insulation, you focus on air tightness of the building, and sometimes that can lead to a very embodied carbon intensive building. So a full passive house sometimes has a higher upfront embodied carbon impact than may be necessary. So that's one consideration. I would also say a lot of the Scandinavian countries have spent a lot of time looking into this, and if you look at what they've done with district heating, some really great sort of low temperature district heat networks there, and so there's, if you're talking about thermal storage over the summer and then using that in the winter, there's some really interesting stuff that they've done there. So without getting into too much detail, I think probably leave it there, but it's a super interesting question.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we had so many great questions. So thank you everyone who submitted your questions. I know we had some of our team members, Asha and Samuel, were both in the chat speaking with you and answering some of those questions. So thanks so much for the audience participation. It was really great today. And now we have a few questions to wrap up for you, Gilbert. And so the first one, and this is the question that we ask all of our guests, which is, if you had the power to change any one thing in the industry, what would it be?
Great question. Thank you. I've been thinking about this quite a lot. I know it's kind of not the I would say a global carbon price. I mean, if it was any one thing outside the industry, I'd also say maybe the war the war in Ukraine would be good if that stopped. People could focus on climate change, but I think a global carbon price would be really, really useful.
Yeah, excellent. Now, the next question that we have for you is from our last guest. So last month we spoke with Helen Cheng, and she asked, what key steps do you recommend to mainstream whole life carbon calculation for the construction industry?
Great question. I think training. So training, a common understanding of the rules. So EN 15978 seems like the most likely candidate, and then common understanding of benchmarks. So we all know what we're working towards. And I think, with the likes of Click and some of the organizations have been working really hard on some of these different initiatives, we'll get there. But ultimately, it'll be driven by client demand. And if clients are saying, we need to understand the life cycle carbon assessment, and we need to know that we how to get a B or above on those benchmarks, then that will drive demand for assessors and calculators and calculations. So training benchmarks would be my my view.
That's great. That's great. Well, we here at One Click LCA, we think training is really important as well. Detailed training and obviously more training, getting more people educated. We'll talk a little bit about our training that we offer a little bit later than this, but that's a great answer to a tough question. And our next question is maybe a little easier for you, but you can challenge our next guest. So our next guest is going to be Josie Cadwallader-Hughes, and we would like to see what you would like to ask her.
Yeah, so I'd like to ask Josie how she thinks we can unlock green finance to make life cycle assessments more accessible.
Great question. That's excellent. I think she'll have to think about that one, and I'd love to hear her answers. So I'm looking forward to asking her that next month. Well, thank you so much for your time. And just a few things before we wrap up today. For our live audience, I wanted to let you know we have quite a lot of resources that you can use for training and education. So you can head over to oneclicklca.com/library, and you'll find all kinds of embodied carbon policy resources there. You can also head over. We have some other websites available on the next slide. We have our Eco Design in Practice series, as well as we have 10 design commandments for cutting your building's embodied carbon, and then our Net Zero Hub, which is full of articles and case studies and lots of resources for you to use. So you'll get these links in the show notes. You can also take a screenshot now if you like. All of these these different pages on our website are available for you, lots of free resources. And we have some free training coming up. So if you head to academy.oneclicklca.com, you'll see our boot camps. We have our construction LCA boot camp coming up in September, and then our EPD boot camp in October. These are both free training opportunities, really great educational resources for you. So if you want to learn more, head over to our website and go ahead and register for the next sessions. And then stay in touch. The conversation doesn't have to end here. We had a great live conversation, but we want to keep it going. So stay in touch with Gilbert or Travis, or you can reach out directly to One Click. You've got the contact information here on the screen. And we do want to hear from you if you're enjoying this series, if you have suggestions, if you have future guests that you would like to see featured. We'd love to hear from you. So go ahead and email us your comments and suggestions. And then lastly, just as a reminder, we have our next Carbon Experts live series episode is coming up in August, on August 16th. So mark your calendars for that. Go ahead to oneclicklca.com/Carbon Experts Live. That's where you'll be able to see next episodes. You'll be able to see today's recording as well as recording of past episodes. So definitely check that out. And Travis and Gilbert, do you have, well, let me ask one at a time. Gilbert, do you have any last words that you'd like to wrap up with?
No, thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me. And look, can keep up the good work.
Awesome. How about you, Travis?
Yeah, no, that was a great conversation. Thanks for joining us, Gilbert. It was a lot of fun.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. Gilbert, thank you for your time. And thank you to our audience for joining us. Great conversation today. And we will see you guys next time. Bye.